So can we all see that?
No.
Yes.
All good? So,
Yes.
and one of my favorite parts of doing this presentation was making that picture of an Air Singapore plane coming out of the eye of a hurricane. But I want to just talk about a trip we did starting on Christmas Day last year. And clearly we hadn't got the memo about the pandemic. And in fact, we had, some of you may remember, we were stuck in Africa when the pandemic struck 2.5 years ago. So we should have learned from our lesson, but we did not. And we set off again, mainly because we had our 6th grandchild born in London on the 23rd of November. And that's our son's first, and his wife's parents are not that
Can you speak up a little?
mobile.
Please?
Oh, can you hear me?
No, not very well.
Just a little, please.
Okay, let me just alter that, and if this doesn't work, then I will try something different.
We're just checking our hearing aids, so they're turned up full. Sorry.
No, that's all right. So is that better if I speak a little louder?
Yes, thank you.
But maybe I'll try a different speaker. Hold on a second. So I'll go to. So is that better?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we had our grandson born, and my son's parents-in-law aren't great travelers, and they were stuck in London in the middle of a pandemic with a new baby. And we thought they needed a little bit of support. And the lead up to that was extremely nerve-wracking because we had to, we didn't want to be stuck there forever. And we had to get an MIQ spot before we could come back. And we booked our air tickets, which were not cheap in the pandemic, well before we had an MIQ spot. And every couple of weeks, they'd release another 20,000, and it was very disheartening. We'd log on the minute you're allowed to log on to find we're 18,000th in the queue. And one morning we were sitting there, and we were both there, fortunately. And the whole process takes about an hour and a half, which is perfect. Because at that time, if you were phoning Air New Zealand, it took about an hour to get through to them. So Sue said, we're 5,000th. So our heart rate started going up, and we were sitting there in the lounge. Sue was watching her computer and MIQ. I was hanging onto the phone to Air New Zealand. And as we dropped into the yes, you've been successful box, Air New Zealand picked up the phone, and we were able to change our tickets to match the only date that MIQ could give us, and we were set. And that was and we left on, as I said, we left on Christmas Day, and that event must have been mid-November, just before the baby was born. And then it became an extremely nerve-wracking and stressful time because we couldn't get COVID, and we really couldn't get anything between that point and leaving. And the whole admin of international travel, and I was saying earlier, my son's just left to go back to the UK. The whole admin surrounding international travel was crippling. We had to do passenger transit forms for Singapore. We had to do passenger arrival forms for the UK. We had to have this was pre-rat test. We had to have a PCR, which was less than 48 hours when we arrived in the UK. And that's quite a trick because it's about a 30-hour flight. So, and we were leaving on Christmas Day, which was a self-inflicted rod for our own back. Anyway, we got through all of that, and we arrived at Auckland Airport. And we're told that normally internationally, Christmas Day is one of the busiest days to fly, and that was the airport. And you look at that and you think it won't take very long to check in. And it didn't. There was no queue. But each individual, it takes half an hour to check them in because all this stuff has to be checked. They've got to check your ACT test. They've got to check your vaccination, your local vaccination for the airport, and then your international vaccination for flying. And eventually we get through and we go up and there's nothing open. One cafe with 3 moldy muffins in the cabinet and a cup of coffee, and luckily I could get a beer there. And that was the site. So it was a beautiful Christmas day. The plane that we got on was actually on the other side, and I'll show it to you in a moment. But it was a lovely Singapore Airlines Dreamliner. And there were all 21 of us flying. So you remember in the olden days, you used to have those containers, 20 or 30 of them would roll out and be mechanically hoisted onto the plane. This is the wagon they use for Great Barrier Airlines. And those were all the bags going to Singapore being loaded onto the plane. And when we got into the plane, you can see 2 people in the top left over there, and there were 2 of us, and then there were 17 other people somewhere else on the plane, and nearly as many staff as passengers. And you wonder, how could it possibly be that an airline could continue doing that for so long through the pandemic? And the answer is twofold. The governments all around the world, including ours, spent a lot of money keeping routes open just because they needed to, but also the whole of commercial air travel has been subsidized by a lot of air freight in the last 2.5 years. And this plane was full of freight, we asked. And I don't have a picture of it. I do have a picture of Singapore Airport, which is somewhat shocking if you've ever been there before. So it's not just a New Zealand thing, that was Singapore. And we flew on an A380 from Singapore to London, and there were 74 people on that airplane, about 1/10 of what it takes. And I don't know if any of you have flown to London and got off there, but from the time our airplane door opened to the time our taxi door closed outside arrivals was 19 minutes. And that was dictated by how fast we could walk down the very long corridors. So Singapore, London, just the same, nothing happening at all. And I'll talk about some of the other medical things, but I mentioned our PCR tests. Over the whole trip, and it will sort of evolve as we go, but over the whole trip, we spent $2,000 on COVID tests.
Wow.
So then we got to London, and this is the reason for the season and the reason for the trip. And he was about 4 weeks old, and he's delightful, Marcus. And after we got there, my son and I went off shopping. And I've got this because we didn't actually shop here, but this was a very posh deli just near the Sainsbury's where we did our shopping. And you can see there that there are white truffles for sale. They come from Italy, and they're £6.50 a gram.
Ooh.
So that makes them about $13,000 a kilogram. So I'm not even sure why you would do that, but that was one of my enduring retail memories of the trip. And then we walked. My son and I came back with the shopping over that very famous crossing. Last people to walk across were John, Ringo, Paul, and George. That's the Abbey Road crossing where the Beatles, and that's the Beatles studio in the background there, the white building. So I've got a few threads that I'll cover off, and one of them is technology. A couple of days later, we were walking along, and this is in Angel, if you know London, sort of inner northeast, not too far from the centre. And that's an Amazon Fresh store. Now, our son's been living there nearly 4 years now. So he's a fully sort of set up UK resident. And if you've got an Amazon account, like you might buy books from Amazon or you might buy Kindle books from Amazon, didn't work for me because my Amazon account is in New Zealand. But there's only one employee in that supermarket, and it's a food and it's a traditional supermarket. In terms of range and price, it's probably somewhere between a small New World and a large Faro, something of that nature. And there's only one employee, and that is the security man at the gate. And you can sort of see his feet, the white soles just inside the door there. And he, down there, those are the security man's shoes, and you can see the shop in the background. And there are gates there, and they open as you get there, as long as you have a valid Amazon account on your phone and it has a credit card against it. So he and I squeezed in there together, and there's no tills or anything. You take yourself a trolley, or you've got a bag. Most people have their own bag, and you walk through the supermarket and you'll take off some cornflakes, and then you might take off and put in your bag some washing powder or some shampoo, and you go down to the fridges at the end and you get some milk and maybe a pack of 6 vegetarian sausages for my son. And then you just walk out again. And as you walk out, your shop gets charged to your Amazon card. And they do that with cameras, you know, so there is some technology called RFID, radio frequency identification. And those are those sort of little bumps, and on some very high value items, they have them and you can just scan that. And maybe 15 years ago, people thought that contactless shopping would all be RFID, but each of those chips is very expensive and you can't afford to put it on a million different items of grocery. So this system is just run by cameras. There are cameras everywhere you look. And you reach out and it's got a picture of you, and it's got a picture of you taking a bottle of shampoo, and they mark it down. Charles has got a bottle of shampoo in his bag. And at the end of the shop, as I say, you just walk out, the security man says fine, and you can feel your phone vibrate in your pocket as the charge goes through. And the other technology that I found really interesting was electric cars. Britain is way ahead of the rest of the world on climate change, no fossil fuel. In fact, every year, quite a large number of days, the Brits have no electricity at all. It's coal generated. They have almost eliminated coal from their electrical generation. There's nuclear, there's some gas, which is fossil fuel, but not too much, and lots of wind, not much solar, a little bit of tide. And here's quite a posh car, and you can see it plugged into a charging point on the electric light pole, which looks like that. And there's another one that's a more traditional charging station that we would see here. And then this is my favorite. So he's kind of taking the charge out of his house. You can see the wires snaking down. And then I guess he's had permission, but he's got a conduit carved into the footpath here. And that keeps his charging cable out of our way. No one's going to trip and be an OSH accident. And he's charging his black cab. So you would not walk down a London street without seeing at least 2 electric vehicles being charged out in the street. And I was very impressed by the whole charging on the light pole concept, because that's a very cheap way to distribute power points to the people, so to speak. Because one thing we would know about street lamps is they all have a electric wire running through the middle of them. And this is a fascinating building. So this is sort of walking towards Angel.
Charles,
Yeah.
could I just ask a question on that last charging? How do they
pay for that electricity they use from the public device?
I don't know. I wondered that. I don't know, but obviously the street one you pay for, and I'm thinking, there's some smart stuff just above the plug there. I think you probably have to log in with an account. And please, everybody, ask questions as we go through. And I was very impressed with this red building. So this red building here is a huge heat exchanger, and it's sitting on top of an intersection, a number of tunnels for the London Underground. And what that does is it sucks hot air out of the underground system, which is great because it means in other places it's pulling clean cold air in. So it's part of the whole air replacement strategy. But this particular building captures the heat in that hot air and turns it into hot water, which it then pumps into these buildings behind it, providing them basically free heating and hot water. So I thought from a technology point of view, a community point of view, that's a wonderful piece of technology. And this is a very old piece of technology, and I did not know it until my son told me. But, and I'm sure some of you know it already, but did you know that you can tell when a post box was put in because it's got the ruler's name there? Like there's GR, which is George Rex. So we know that was put in place when George was on the throne, and all the latest post boxes have got E2R. It's lovely. I never knew that. So we had a couple of exercise themes while we were in London. We walked the whole length of the Regent's Canal, past Regent's Park and the zoo down to the Thames, and at a later date, and I've got some other photos of that, we walked the full length of the Lee River Valley from the Epping Forest to Canary Wharf. Not all on the same day, clearly. And I kept a tally of how far we walked, and over nearly 2 months, about an 8 week stay, we walked the equivalent of Auckland to Wellington. So that's my son on the left and Sue on the right, and that's walking from Angel to King's Cross on the canals, and the canals are just amazing. You can get everywhere. And there's some very big houseboats, and a lot of people live on the river. And you can even live on the river with your dog. And he'd obviously been shopping, and he was heading off to his houseboat, and the dog just jumped off the canoe, and lovely. Next, okay. And they have some quite beautiful parts. That's between Angel and Camden. And there's a lock there, and the water goes up and down, and they move the boats around. And then that was the day we ended up on the Thames, and then we walked back from where the Regent's Canal joins all the way back to St. Paul's. So the other one of the other threads of our trip was the Orkney Islands, because of late, certainly the last 2 or 3 years, I've become quite interested in genealogy and my heritage, so to speak. And my grandfather was born, so this is the Orkney Islands. That's this bit down here is the top of Scotland and John O. Groats. And these are the Orkney Islands. And this piece of land here is called Scarpa Flow. It's not land, this piece of water here, which is surrounded by the islands, is called Scarpa Flow. And that was the main naval base for the Royal Navy during both the First and the Second World War. And between Armistice Day and peace, the German Navy was being held here. And they made the mistake of leaving the German sailors on the boats. And a piece of what we call now fake news, a rumor, spread through the German fleet saying the war's going to start again, and they're going to use our boats against us. So all of them in unison pulled the plug at the bottom of the boat, and the whole German high seas fleet from what was left from the First World War is under the water there in Scapa Flow. And it's a major diving destination. And I did consider doing some diving myself. I've done a bit of scuba diving, but it's very expensive. And you can't use a wetsuit. The water's about 1 or 2 degrees. So you have to use a dry suit. And also it would have taken 2 days. And I didn't have that amount of time off from the boss. But my grandfather actually comes from this little island up here called Papawestre, and that's Big Westray. And if you're looking at this, just to put it into context, this is about 2/3 of the size of Waiheke, and this is about 2/3 of the size of Ponui Island, and he was born there and moved there. But this, believe it or not, is a hugely significant historical location for Europe. Here on Papawestre, and I'm going to bore you with a video of getting there, is the oldest house in Europe. It's over 6,000 years old. It's a stone farmhouse, and it was a Neolithic settlement. And here on what the islanders on this big island optimistically call the mainland is a large Neolithic village, which is a United Nations World Heritage Center, and it's huge. I've got a picture of it later on. And they were living there about 5,500 years ago, which was about 1,000 years before Stonehenge was a piece of stone dust in someone's eye, and before about 1,500 years before the Egyptians built their pyramids. So this really was the home of Stone Age, Neolithic civilization in Europe. And the other interesting thing, which you will get a first eye view of right now, is between Papawestre here and Westray is the shortest scheduled commercial flight in the world, which we did to get there. So that's looking down on Scapa Flow as we moved in, as we came into the mainland island. And that's a place called Stromness, which is very beautiful. And I was much amused by this. This is a lifeboat on a pier at Stromness. And I'm thinking to myself, how small is the population on this island that they can all get in a lifeboat if it starts sinking? But I guess it's for training. And that's looking out over Scapa Flow. And these islands are 60 degrees north. And to give it context, in Invercargill, I think, is about 50 degrees south. So it was very windy. And when you read what to do in Orkney when you go there, every article you read says, park into the wind. And you think, are they being serious? Are they telling me how to drive? Do they not know how long I have been driving? But it is very serious advice that you actually need to follow, because the wind is so strong that if you park with back into the wind, the door gets ripped out of your hand when you open your car. So it's a wild and blustery place. And that's the plane we flew on to get to Westray from the mainland. We flew on a normal sort of ATR, same sort of plane that you would fly on from Auckland to Palmy, to get from Glasgow to Kirkwall, which was the town on the main island. And then we flew from Kirkwall here on the main island up to landed on Papawestre, didn't get out of the tiny little plane, and then flew across this red arrow here to Westray. And that is the shortest scheduled commercial flight in the world. They do it twice a day in each direction, once in the morning, once in the afternoon.
Sorry,
If
Charles.
Yeah.
Charles, how was the landing?
I'll show you.
Oh, good.
I will show you. And if you're a local, it costs you £9.50. It cost us £30, which wasn't enormously challenging. And that's because the Orkneys are actually extremely prosperous, lots of farming. And you wouldn't think so, and we were there in winter, but all the cows live inside. Cows outside. They all have massive barns with between 30 and 100 head of cattle. So this is leaving Kirkwall, and this is Papawestre, and we landed on that little strip there. And then we get in, then once we were on the ground, we started the shortest commercial. So this is going from Papa Westray to Westray, which is a 4-minute flight. And there's Westray in the background. We just crossed that little bit of water. And there's only one car to hire on Westray. And I arranged with the guy from whom we hired it to and he picked us up from the airport to film us coming in. And on this little bit of rock here live a flock of sheep. And somebody goes out twice a year and shears them and brings the wool back, and they live on seaweed.
Ooh.
So that's just the airport, and then this is us coming into land, and that's the wind in the background. And these pilots do this twice a day, and they've been doing it for 30 years, both of them. We met both of them, but they've been doing it, each of them been doing it for 30 years. You can see the plane just hanging in the wind there, getting buffeted around.
Oh. It's not. It's just been blown that place.
And there is a ferry, a daily ferry, in fact, twice daily, morning and afternoon, but we were advised by friends and sort of semi-relatives to fly rather, because there are fewer cancellations with the planes than the sea, because those pilots have been doing it for years and years, and they know the way the wind works, and the ships just become unmanageable in the rough seas. So I said there was only one hired car on Westray, and I'd got hold of, found them long before, found the name of the guy, Stuart Brote, lovely fella, and booked the hired car, and we had emails, and the day before, and he was going to pick us up from the airport because he owns the shop, the one hired car, the only petrol pump, and they all do duty at the airport. Because it's a commercial flight, they have to have a manned fire tender and all sorts of safety people. So everyone on the island takes turns at being at the airport, and it was his day anyway. And I sent him an email the day before saying, "Hey, Stu, don't forget we're coming tomorrow." And he sent an embarrassed email back saying, "Oh, yes, that's right. Well, the hired car is broken and it's down on the mainland for fixing. But don't worry, I'll lend you the transit van." And that is said transit van. And the sliding door on the other side didn't really work, just enough to get the suitcase in. And the back door didn't open at all. And Sue's door seemed all right until later. And that's behind we had a wonderful B&B. Again, I'd kind of made contact with the guy. There's only 600 people on the island, so you've got to do everything on a very one-to-one basis. So Jerry, who was an English guy, but been living on the island for 20 years, and said he thinks soon he'll be considered a local. And that's just behind his B&B. And that is about 9:30 in the morning. That's sunrise at 9:30. And that's looking a bit further on, that's the sun coming up behind the village. That's a 15th century, 16th century castle. And there's Sue. We took a nice long walk to the lighthouse. Very windy, unbelievably windy. And like the Shetlands, which are very close and they're part of the same administrative region, the Northern Isles, Orkney has its own little ponies. And in fact, it's a general fact that wherever you have islands, the species of flora and fauna that live on the mainland are always bigger. The island has miniature of everything. So if you ever get a question on the chase, which I did hear once, which one of these places has a very small frog, and there were two places in South America and an island in the Caribbean, and I said instantly, island in the Caribbean, because it's an island, so it will have its frogs will be smaller than the mainlands. And there lies my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, an uncle, a great-uncle who died in a shipwreck when he was 21, a great-aunt who died of meningitis when she was 21, working as a servant in Edinburgh. And they're all there, and there are only 2 or 3 surnames there in the whole churchyard. And that's the church. It's called Lady Kirk or Lady Church. And as you can see now, ruined, but that was built in about 1100 AD. And at the time, the Orkneys were part of Norway. So from about 800 AD to about 1350 AD, the Orkneys were actually part of Norway. And the Orkney flag is a Norwegian flag with a couple of colours changed out, and a lot of them speak a very special dialect. Nobody speaks Gaelic there, that's the Western Isles. And it became part of England because the Danish or the Norwegian queen at the time was supposed to provide a dowry when one of the King Jameses got married and didn't have the cash. So as part of the dowry, handed over the Orkneys instead of cash. And that's standing at my grandpa's grave, looking across the bay to our Airbnb, which was there. But the significance of this photograph is I took that at 12:15 lunchtime.
Oh.
So it was a very short, a very cold, and a very wintry day. And we went to visit the house that my grandfather grew up in as a tiny boy. And as I said, so my great-grandfather had 5 kids, and one of the sons died in a shipwreck. One of the daughters died of meningitis as a servant in Edinburgh. The other daughter had a miscarriage and then never procreated again. So my grandfather moved to Africa and had a branch of the family, and his brother moved to Canada and had another branch of the family. And I'm in contact with all of those now. And my great-grandfather's brother moved to Dunedin in 1865, and the South Island is just crawling with my cousins. And I was very happy to discover that one of them owns Mount Maud Winery. So she can expect a visit from me any day soon. But so these people, this delightful lady is called May, and her mum was my great aunt's servant, housekeeper. And because great uncle John was off in Canada, and my granddad Alexander was down in Africa, there was no one to inherit the farm when great aunt Jane died. So she gave it to May's mum, and May is still there. And she's been running the house they grew up in as a B&B for the last 30 or 40 years. And this is her husband, Tom. And, you know, this might not look that flash, but they are extremely financial, for want of a better word. And Tom was taking us for a walk around, and they're just massive barns everywhere. It looks like it looks like a village, not a person's house. And there's a barn there with 100 cows in it. And then he opened this barn. He said, "This is my latest toy." And it was a massive combine harvester. It cost him £350,000. So it's far away and it's cold and it's windy, but there's money there. So this is back to the mainland. That's one of the, sorry, yes?
A question on the Orkneys. Is the name Orkney, is it an English derivative or a Norwegian derivative, that name?
Norwegian derivative. Norwegian. And so this is one of the Neolithic houses. They were covered with sort of thatch roofs and they all interconnected by passages. So you can understand how the Norse kind of troll legends came about. And that's a sort of standing stone with great significance. And they have a circle of stones, which I haven't got a picture of, but it's slightly smaller than Stonehenge, but it predates Stonehenge by 1,000 years. And the water there is very beautiful and very clear. And this was quite good fun. We caught the train home from Edinburgh. We wanted to be home. We didn't want to spend too much time away from the baby. So by catching the train overnight as a sleeper, we would get an extra day in London, and that was great fun. And then we got back to London, and about a week after getting back, and only about 8 days before we were supposed to fly home, guess what happened? We got COVID. Well, I got COVID. And I hightailed out of the house. And I was completely symptom-free before, during, and after. The only reason I knew I had COVID is because we had a baby, a very young baby in the house. I was doing a rat test every second day. And one day it came positive. And I'll never forget that moment because it was new to us. I mean, now it's much more common. I was standing there, I was holding this thing in my hand and thinking, how am I going to tell this to Sue? It was very early in the morning. So I quietly threw it in the bin and did it again. And it was still positive. You know, they say the greatest sign of madness is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So I was still positive. And the kids, they don't get up early, these young people. So I packed my bag and I headed off and I went into the Walthamstow Travel Lodge, which was about 50 meters down the road. I hastily packed the bag and went there and I got a room on the 11th floor. And that was my view from the 11th floor. And I stayed there for 7 days. And Sue tested positive about 2 days later and came to join me. So that was nice. That was a lot less lonely. And then at the end of my 7 days, and to be fair, a little bit before the end of her 7 days, we rented a car and went down to Cornwall. And that was lovely. And we rented a cottage. I'll show you very briefly in a minute. And I'm watching the time. And we didn't interact with anybody. We didn't break any rules, but we did relocate. And we drove through Dartmoor, which was lovely. And this is a little village called Widdicombe on the Moor, Widdicombe on the Moor. And you've heard that expression, Uncle Tom Cobley and all? Anyone heard that? So this is where Uncle Tom Cobley came from. There's a picture of a horse with about 9 people on it, and there's a song. You can look it up on Google about Widdicombe Market and going to the market. And it's a bit like Aesop and his fable. They kept putting extra people on the horse. And finally, there was everyone on the horse, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. And Cornwall was lovely. That was one of the highlights of our trip. It was just beautiful. That's a place called Polperro, and we stayed very close to there. In a cottage, just by ourselves. Lovely artwork all over the place. Can see the mural on the wall there. Beautiful sea. We had very nice weather from a cloud and precipitation point of view, but it was still pretty cold. And this is a place called Port Isaac, and this is where Doc Martin is filmed. And they were there. The whole film crew was there. None of the actors, but all the crew were there. Because in 6 months' time, you can expect a Christmas special, which will be the last ever Doc Martin production. And the crew, that whole beach where the boats are, was full of vans, and there were people with clipboards and measures and scripts wandering around. It was great fun watching. That's one of the streets in Port Isaac. And if you watch Doc Martin, there's that pub with a veranda, and it seems like a pub. It's not. It's just a house, and they dress it up as a pub, and they put awning out, and and that's it there. That bit there is actually the pub, and none of the inside scenes take place in this. These are just outside scenes, because the village charges an absolute fortune to Doc Martin for the use of their village, and in return they shut the whole village down for the period of filming. So we were very lucky. If we'd gone the next day when the actors were going to be there, we wouldn't have been allowed in. So because it's so expensive to be filming there, all the inside scenes are filmed in a barn just sort of up that hill and over the back, and they've got a movie set inside the barn. And that's the school, which is actually an old church and running as a pub. And I was in a culinary sense in my seventh heaven in the UK, because I believe that the greatest achievement of culinary science is chips and gravy. And it's very hard to get good chips and gravy in New Zealand, but in England and Cornwall and even the Orkneys, you can get good chips and gravy everywhere. So we had a lovely chips and gravy in there. And I've just put here, this is your personal data. I mentioned in the Amazon shop, there were cameras everywhere in the Amazon shop, but just generally in the UK, there are cameras absolutely everywhere. On the street, in the buildings, pointing at all the buildings. You know when you're walking down a footpath anywhere that's reasonably built up in the UK, you are being recorded. And quite often there will be information here. So this is your personal data. This is in a car park saying we're filming you. If you do anything horrible, we're going to come and take your children and sell them to slavery. It's quite intimidating. And that's our cottage in just about 3 k's out of Polperro. But the really fascinating thing about that, and Sue hadn't noticed until I asked her, she booked that on Book-a-Batch, New Zealand Book-a-Batch, whilst we were in isolation in Walthamstow, and paid for it in New Zealand dollars. So you can, if you go onto Book-a-Batch, you can get cottages all over the world, which I had absolutely no idea of. So these are just quick shots of the Lee River Valley, which is a lovely long walk, and that's one of the lovely pubs along the way, and very beautiful. But it's not uniformly beautiful. So there's a boat that didn't quite make it through the winter, and it wasn't the only semi-sunk boat we saw. And that graffiti and rubbish, unfortunately, it was very prevalent. We love London, both of us, but we found it to be very dirty, and a lot of evidence of antisocial behaviour, but lots of lovely bird life. That was a little robin redbreast that hopped down and sat on a balustrade near where we were having lunch one day. And then we left. We came home, and that was how Marcus developed in the 2 months that we were there. And he's a delightful young man, and we take full credit for all of that. So coming back, there weren't that many more people. Had a beautiful moon on the way back and into MIQ, and we definitely drew the long straw with MIQ. We were again on about the 7th floor of the Novotel at Auckland Airport. And that was the view from our window straight out over towards the Manukau Heads and past that peninsula, whose name I forget for the moment.
Fitu?
Yeah, that's a Fitu. This is a Fitu, and then a Cornwallis Peninsula. That little lump there is the Cornwallis Peninsula on the northern side. And yes, this is the Fitu Peninsula here. And we were allowed out once a day for 40 minutes to exercise. But I'm always one that likes to push the envelope. So if you phone up again and there was nobody in the yard, they would let you do it again. And we had a perfect view of the yard. That was the yard from our window. And in 2 40-minute stints a day, I could do my 10,000 steps. But and I don't run anymore because my knees banned me from doing that many decades ago. But you had to walk very fast to get 10,000 steps out of 80 minutes, but we did it every day. and we had 7 days of beautiful sunsets, and that's it. So I hope that wasn't too boring.
It was great.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
And it was a tremendous adventure, and we loved it. And we rented the car in Orkney, and we also rented the car to drive down to Cornwall, which was lovely. Quite a long drive from London to Cornwall. And there was quite a lot of medical stuff around catching COVID. So we had to change our flights because we wouldn't be able to fly. And I started off by thinking, well, I did it as a rat test. What the system doesn't know about, the system won't worry about. But I actually tested positive on a Friday. And by the time Sunday came around, I thought, well, we're going to have to deal with this administratively. So I phoned up their equivalent of Healthline, and they said, well, it runs from when you first test positive. And I went onto the site, and you can only put your test in for today and yesterday. So I officially got COVID on Sunday, although I got it on Friday. And that could have been a problem. If Sue hadn't got it, it would have been a problem because she would have been able to fly back. I wouldn't have, because you have to be clear for so many days after being symptom free, and it goes from when you started being positive. So for a little while, it seemed like it was a mistake not reporting it straight away. But the minute Sue got it, it became irrelevant. But then we were into a whole different administrative nightmare, which was it had taken us so long to get a spot in MIQ. Now we wouldn't be able to take it up again. And we had all these flights that were quite expensive. And how easy was that going to be? And don't believe what you read about MIQ. Apart from the hassle of getting into it, they were fantastic people to deal with. The hotel was amazing. Food was excellent. They looked after us really well. And I suppose not everybody gets the same experience, but where we were, it was like that. And once I had found the right person in MIQ to talk to, they said they would rearrange, they'd give us another slot. They understand the situation. They came back to us with a couple of options. And I got hold of Air New Zealand and I had to get a flight on those days. And I made it sound quite short and simple then, but that whole exercise took 6 hours on the telephone from London to Auckland to get that arranged. But we got it arranged, and we still needed a PCR test. But the problem with PCR tests is about 25% of the population, once you've had COVID, you might continue to test positive with a PCR for up to 3 months afterwards. So how do you deal with that? There's an official way to deal with that. You go to a doctor and you say, okay, I've had COVID, and this is why the start date is really important, because you can only go to the doctor so long after having COVID, which is why we stuck an extra week in Cornwall into the program to put some distance between us and COVID. And the doctor looks you up and down and listens to your heart and writes you a letter saying, you've had COVID, you're better, you can fly. But because you need a PCR test that's for less than 48 hours when you land, and doctors difficult to get to, we had to do both. So we went to the doctor and we got our letter. That cost us about $400 or $500. And then we both got negative PCR tests. So we didn't need to do that anyway. But if there's a couple of lessons about flying in this season, it's do not go for the cheapest. If you're going to buy a ticket, especially for international travel, buy the most flexible ticket you possibly can. Don't cut corners and give yourself lots of options. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it's a great adventure.
Brilliant.
Any questions, folks? That was great, Charles. You do realize you need to travel again so you can come and talk to us again.
Well, we had a trip planned for Christmas. Well, not for Christmas, for early December to Antarctica.
Oh,
Ooh,
But the travel company has yet to be advised. But our youngest daughter, Maggie, who's an occupational therapist and lives in Golflands, has a third, a very important life event late in November. And if all things go well, Marcus will get a baby cousin right about his birthday time.
oh.
So that's now going to be off the cards, and Maggie's had her scan, so I really must get on to telling them that. We'll do that another time.
It's an observation that we were in Britain about 6 months before COVID became a pandemic.
Yeah.
And long and short of it, Claire ended up with 7 days in Bristol Hospital with what they called community-acquired pneumonia. Also, she was in isolation there, but we were both probably not a lot better than the other. But a lot of places you've covered there is places that we had hoped to go to in the fortnight that we had scheduled to be in Britain.
Oh, such a pity. Well, you have to go back.
Yes, please.
I'm just waiting for that lotto to come to the party.
Well, don't bother today. I already have it.
Oh, okay. We'll take next week's.
Okay. Okie dokie. Well, you guys have a
You were
lovely
saying
morning.
Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
You were saying about Doc Martin and the school there being filmed. They go up to Dalabol School, which is up the coast quite some way, and inland, and they film all the interior scenes of the school in that school.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know that.
Yeah, because they damaged the school to make it look old and dilapidated a bit inside, and they've repainted and redecorated the school about 3 times. I've got a cousin who lives there and tells me, oh, well, they're here to film Doc Martin again. It's school time, so they take the inside of the school and redo it all, make it look sort of as though it shouldn't be.
I'll bore you with a funny story about Cornwall. So when Sue and I were first married, we saved and saved and saved, and we took a year's holiday. It was not a working holiday. There was not a skerrick of work the whole 12 months. We saved enough money to go on holiday for a year, and we Greyhound bussed around the US, and we combi vanned around Europe, and we bussed, I think it was called National Bussed around the UK. And when we were then in isolation, Sue said, let's go to Cornwall. We've never been there. We missed that on our own. And I said, sounds fantastic. So we said, the one thing we must really do while we're down there is go to a pub, have scrumpy, have a Cornish pasty. And we did all of those things. And as I said, it was a highlight of the trip for us. And then wind the clock forward about 6 or 8 weeks. And I was actually going through our old OE pictures because somebody had asked me for a picture. And I looked at a page and I did a double take. There was a picture of Sue in Penzance. And I said, what? Penzance? And I called her over. I said, do you know we've been to Penzance? She said, no, we've never been to Cornwall. But yep, there it was.
Oh, wow.
we were in Penzance, and Sue kept a diary, and we went back and found the diary and looked up those days, and we had scrumpy, and we had a Cornish pasty.
The only trouble with Cornwall at the moment is all the houses are being bought up by people in London and the Midlands as holiday homes, and the locals just cannot afford to buy a home. There's, you see on the television here of people living in sheds and old pigsties that are being converted to houses. All the rest of it. But there just isn't. Nobody can afford a house down there. They're so expensive, because the people from London and the Midlands who are buying them up and only coming down there for a month every year are paying horrendous prices.
Yes. And we certainly would never recommend anyone go there in summer. We'd get to because they're all these little villages and
Yes.
the roads are very narrow. And the car parks are bigger than 4 or 5 rugby fields way out of town. And then there's a park and ride to get from your car
Yes.
to the town. And we'd be driving towards one of the little villages, let's say Mount St. Michael near Penzance. And there'd be a sign, okay, queues, park now. And that would be 4 or 5 kilometers from where we were headed. So it must be just unbelievable in the season. But it was lovely there. And we went to Padstow, where Rick Stein, the famous chef, has his restaurant. And he was there. And there was a sign outside, King Rick is in residence and cooking tonight. And I went in and said, would it be okay if I brought my own tomato sauce? And they chased me out.
Big bosses.
Oh, Charles. Well, that's been great, Charles. Is there anybody else that wants to ask a question before we close off? No, thank
That'll
you.
all come later.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
well, have a lovely day, everybody. And if you do have any questions or want the presentation, let Lee know and I'll email it and any answers through.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank
Have
you.
a
Thank
good
you.
day.
All the
Bye.
best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.